Good afternoon. It's a real honor to be with you all here, and a great pleasure indeed. I've been to many conferences that are held by Eritreans down the years, and I must say this is one that really feels different, because I can honestly say that in the old saying, you are changing the weather. You're changing the way that things are working. And one of the key things that you have done, one of the key lessons I think that you have learned from all those previous conferences, which were just words, is that you've taken to heart the slogan that the suffragette movement had in this country all those years ago. Deeds, not words. And that is what singles you out from all the previous events that have happened, and it is only by deeds that I think you will achieve your ends. But we'll see where it goes, and I wish you all well. I stand before you for only one reason. I'm a Cape Townian. I was born in Africa, like so many of you were, but what on earth am I doing talking about Eritrea? It all comes down to one person. When I was working for the Labour Party in the 1970s and 80s, one young man came into my office who was unlike anybody else that I saw. And his name was Ermias Debasai, better known as Papaya, who came in and he saw me and he said, "You must come to my country." I'd had lots of invitations, but I hadn't one like that. I said, "There's a civil war. What are you doing? You were fighting the Ethiopians. How can I come?" "You get to Port Sudan, we will look after you." So I went with my wife to Port Sudan, and after a rather long journey and lots of Eritrean music, we arrived finally in the rear bases of the Eritrean struggle. And we saw what was being done by your people to fight for your liberation. Those amazing hospitals. I can still imagine the beds that were there, the people being returned from the war front with terrible wounds and being healed in amazing ways. My wife was absolutely astonished. She is a nurse. The intravenous fluids that you were making there, the printing that was being done in those bunkers, just astonishing, absolutely amazing what was happening. And I remember standing under the stars. I was representing the British Labour Party, and there were many other parties there at the time. It was the first Congress of Women and Workers. And I remember we all sang the Internationale. "Arise, ye starlings, from your slumbers. Arise, ye citizens of woe." That's what we sung under the stars in Eritrea, and I'll never forget it. It was just extraordinary. Everybody sang it in their own language, and I sang it very badly in English, but other people sang it in Russian and Spanish, and of course Tigrinya. And then I remember going again a second time, this time when I was working for the BBC, and going up and with the EPLF into the trenches, looking down on Keren, seeing the Ethiopian tanks and artillery firing up at our trenches. Thank goodness they were deep trenches, I must assure you. The aircraft flying around, and I was told that sometimes to get down, the bombs were coming down and they were exploding around us. And I thought, how are you going to win? How are you going to win? But you did. You did. And you achieved your freedom, or what should have been your freedom. And then we started getting the stories. And I will never forget those stories. The stories of the young men and women who had been crippled and disabled by the war, who had given their bodies for the war, having to try to walk into Asmara, hobble into Asmara, sometimes in wheelchairs, and then being opened fire on by the police. I mean, what was this? couldn't understand. I really found that hard to understand. And then I remember the stories of the soldiers walking around and firing in the air because they wanted to speak to the leadership. Because they hadn't been paid all those years when they were fighting, that was fine. But when they come back to Asmara, then they said, look, we have families, we've got to look after them. We can't be going, we have to have something. And President Sars came out and he met them and he promised them, I will settle your problems. We'll deal with it. Go back to the barracks. They went back to the barracks, and what happened? He rounded them up, they were shot. And then Papayo was recalled from his ambassadorial duties, and he was in jail. Never on trial. I don't even know what he's been accused of. But from that day to this, as far as I know, he's still in jail, rotting. I once managed to speak to him. I don't know what's happened. I don't even know if he's still alive. But it was only because of him that I was here. And then there's the tragedy of the war about May, if it was about May. Thousands dead. The G15, the G13, the people being rounded up, the closure of all your newspapers, the crushing of any hope of democracy, the shock that went through your organizations, your people in exile and in the country. And ever since then, the tragic exile of people, the flight across the borders, the leaving the bones in the Sahara, the deaths in the Mediterranean, the deaths in the Channel. This has been your fate, and it's been a terrible, terrible one for me to have to first report for the BBC, but later to have to try and do what I can after I retired, which was in 2013, and I've talked about. But you have experienced it. It is in your blood, it is in your families, it is every one of you knows the pain and the suffering that you have endured. And why? For what? For absolutely nothing. There was no reason that any of this should have happened. You were promised freedom and democracy, you laid down your lives for this. And what did you get? It's just a tragedy. Now, in 1949, Mao Zedong made a famous speech in which he says, we, the Chinese people, will no longer be a nation subsidized, insulted, and humiliated. The Chinese people have stood up. You all stood up in 1991. You had your freedom. And then it turned out to be a sham. And the fact that you've had to do this now and face this moment twice in your history, twice in the history of your own people, twice in the history of your own lives, is an absolute tragedy. And that we are having to be here for so many people now to be in exile, for so many people to know the pain of being torn away from your people and your country, to be away from your families, is something that I know, I have experienced it for 13 years. I could not go home because of my stand-up apartheid. They wouldn't let me have a visa. Thank God that is in the past. It's the greatest joy of my life. The greatest joy of my life was when Nelson Mandela walked free and could stand in Cape Town and speak to us as ordinary men and women, free people. That was what I really wanted. And I wait for that moment to be in your country to remove it. You have so many people, great people amongst you, architects, judges, painters, civil servants, men and women who have served their communities down the years. We have luckily now a great cyclist who is doing wonderful things, and I'm sure you are filled with joy when you see the success that he is he is achieving, because he doesn't just do it for himself, he does it for your nation, for your people, and that is a wonderful thing to do. And the only thing I would end with in saying is this. When I worked in the anti-apartheid movement, which I did for something like 30 years, we always thought we would fail, and we did fail. Every single one of our initiatives failed. But in the end, every single one of our initiatives came together, and together we won. And that is what brought victory, and that is what brought the end of apartheid. The totality of our opposition, the totality of our movement, the way that we united to bring together our people and to overthrow this dictatorial, disgusting system. And I only have one thing to say right at the end is this. In the Jewish community, there's a saying which says, next year we will celebrate in Jerusalem. Next year, I hope, maybe even this year, I will have coffee with you tomorrow. Thank you.